the primitive beast. The primitive beast was strong in buck, and under the fierce conditions of the trail life, it grew and grew. Yet it was a secret growth. He was too busy adjusting himself to the new life to feel at ease. Not only did he not pick fights, he avoided them whenever possible. There was a kind of careful thoroughness in his attitude. He was not prone to recklessness and sudden action. In the bitter hatred between him and Spitz, he showed no impatience and avoided all quarrelsome acts. On the other hand, possibly because he saw Buck as a dangerous rival, Spitz never lost an opportunity to show his teeth. He even went out of his way to bully Buck. He tried constantly to start a fight that could only end in the death of one dog's death or the other. Early in the trip, this might have taken place, had it not been for an unusual accident. At the end of this day, they made a bleak and miserable camp at the shore of Lake LaBarge. Driving snow, a wind that cut like white-hot knife, and a darkness had forced them to grope from a camping place. They could hardly have done worse, and their backs rose against a wall of rock. Perrault and Francois were forced to make their fire and spread their sleeping robes on the ice of the lake itself. They discarded their tented dye in order to travel light. They built a fire of a few sticks of driftwood, but the fire melted through the ice and left them to eat supper in the dark. Buck made his nest close to the sheltering rock. It was so snug and warm that he was reluctant to leave it when Francois passed out the fish, which he had thawed over the fire. But when Buck finished his share and returned, he found his nest occupied. A warning snarl told him that the intruder was Spitz. Until now, Buck had avoided trouble with his enemy, but this was too much. The beast in him roared, and he sprang at Spitz with a fury that surprised them both, but especially Spitz. Spitz's whole experience with Buck had taught him that Buck was an unusually timid dog, one who held his own only because of his great weight and size. Francois was surprised, too. When they shot out in a tangle from the disrupted nest, and he realized the cause of the trouble, "Ah!" he cried to Buck. "Give it to him, by gar! Give it to him, the dirty thief!" Spitz was equally willing. He was crying with sheer rage and eagerness as he circled back and forth for his chance to spring in. Buck was no less eager and no less cautious, as he likewise circled back and forth for the advantage. But it was then that the unexpected thing happened. The thing that put off their struggle for supremacy far into the future. An oath from Perrault and a resounding impact of a club upon a bony frame and a sheer yelp of pain were the first signals of a period of noise and confusion. The camp was suddenly discovered to be alive with starving huskies, 80 to 100 of them who scented the camp from some Indian village. They had crept in while Buck and Spitz were fighting. When the two men sprang among them with their heavy clubs, they showed their teeth and fought back. The smell of food made them crazy. Perrault found one with his head buried in the grub box. His club landed heavily on his gaunt ribs, and the box was tipped over on the ground. Instantly, there were 20 hungry animals scrambling for bread and bacon. They ignored the blows of the clubs. They yelped and howled under the rain of the blows, but struggled madly until the last crumb had been eaten. In the meantime, the astonished team dogs had burst out of their nests only to be attacked by fierce invaders. Never had Buck seen such dogs. It seemed as if their bones would burst through their skins. They were mere skeletons, their skin hanging loosely from their frames, and blazing eyes and drooling fangs. But the hunger madness made them powerful and terrifying. The team dogs were swept back against the cliff at the first attack. Buck was attacked by 3 huskies, and in an instant his head and shoulders were ripped and slashed. The uproaring was frightening. Billy was crying as usual. Dave and Solix, dripping blood from dozens of wounds, were fighting bravely side by side. Joe was snapping like a demon. Once his teeth closed on the front leg of a husky, and he crunched down through the bone. Pike leapt upon the crippled animal, breaking its neck with a quick flash of teeth and a jerk. Buck got to his frothing enemy by the throat and was sprayed with blood when his teeth sank through the jugular vein. The warm taste of blood in his mouth urged him on to greater fierceness. This was his first taste of blood. He threw himself onto another husky, and at the same time he felt his teeth sink into his own throat. It was Spitz, treacherously attacking him from the side. You're on the top of page 30. Perrault and Francois had cleaned out their part of camp and now hurried to save their dogs. The wild wave of starving animals rolled back before them, and Buck shook himself free. But it was only for a moment. The two men had to run back to save the food, and the Huskies returned to the attack. Billy, terrified into bravery, sprang through the savage circle and fled over the ice. Pike and Doug followed at their heels with the rest of the team behind them. As Buck drew himself together to spring after them, and out of the corner of his eye he saw Spitz rushing toward him, apparently intending to throw him down. But once off his feet and under the mass of Huskies, there was no hope for him. But he braced himself to the shock of Spitz's charge, then joined the flight out on the lake. Later, the 9 team dogs gathered together and looked for shelter in the forest. Although they had not been chased, they were in a bad way. Each of them were wounded in 4 or 5 places, and some of them were wounded severely. Dub was badly injured in a hind leg. Dolly, the last husky added to the team at Dyea, had a badly torn throat. Joe had lost an eye, and Billy, the good-natured, with his ear chewed to ribbons, cried and whimpered throughout the night. At daybreak, they limped cautiously back to camp, where they found the looters gone and the 2 men in bad tempers. Fully half their food supply was gone. The Huskies had chewed through the sledge straps, the canvas coverings. In fact, nothing that might possibly be eaten had escaped them. They had eaten a pair of Perrault's moose-hide moccasins or shoes, chunks out of leather straps, and even 2 feet off the end of Francois's whip. He broke from his gloomy thoughts about his whip to look over his wounded dogs. "Ah, my friends," he said softly, "maybe it make you mad dogs, those many bites. Maybe all mad dogs. Scart 'em! What do you think, Perrault?" The courier shook his head doubtfully. With 400 miles of trail still between him and Dawson, he could not afford to have rabies break out among his dogs. 2 hours of cursing and hard work got the harnesses into shape, and the wounded stiff team was underway. They struggled painfully over the hardest part of the trail they had seen so far, and for that matter, the hardest part of the entire trail. The 30-mile river was wide open. Its wild water did not want to freeze, and it was only in the eddies and the quiet places that the ice held it all. 6 days of exhausting effort were needed to cover these 30 terrible miles, and terrible they were, for the lives of dog and men were at risk every foot of the way. Perrault, who was nosing on away, broke through the ice bridges a dozen times. He was saved each time by the long pole he carried, which held so that it fell across the hole made by his body. But a cold snap was on, and the thermometer registering at 50 below zero. Each time Perrault broke through the ice, he had to build a fire and dry his garments, or else he would freeze to death. Nothing frightened or discouraged him. It was because nothing frightened or discouraged him that he had been chosen to be the government courier or mailman. He took all kinds of risks, single-mindedly pushing the little pinched face into the frost and struggling on from dim to dawn and dark. He skirted the shores on the rim and the ice that bent and crackled under his foot, and on which they dared not stop. Once the sled broke through the ice along with Dave and Buck. They were half frozen, all but drowned by the time that they were dragged out. They were like popsicles, doggy popsicles. As usual, a fire had to be built to save them from freezing. They were solidly coated with ice. The 2 men kept them running around the fire, sweating and thawing until so close they came to the fire that they were singed by the flames. Another time, Spitz went through, dragging the whole team after him up to Buck. Buck pulled backwards with all of his strength, and his front paws were slippery edge and the ice trembling and snapping all around. But behind him was Dave, who also was straining back, and behind the sled was Francois, pulling till his tendons cracked. Again, the rim ice broke away before and behind, and there was no escape except up the cliff. Perrault scaled or climbed it by a miracle, while Francois prayed for just that miracle. With every sled lashing and bit of harness made into a long rope, the dogs were hoisted, one by one, to the top of the cliff. They're fishing for dogs, almost. Francois came up last, after the sled and its load, then searched for a place to descend. The descent eventually was made by using the rope, and by nightfall they were back on the river only a quarter of a mile from where they had started. By the time they reached the COTW and the good ice, Buck was worn out. The rest of the dogs were in the same condition, but Perrault pushed them to make up lost time. The first day they covered 30 to 5 miles to Big Salmon. The next, another 35 more to Little Salmon. And the third day they covered 40 miles, which brought them well up to the Five Fingers. Buck's feet were not so compact and hard as the feet of the Huskies. His feet had softened during the many generations since the days of his wild ancestors were tamed by the cave dwellers. All day long he limped in agony. Once camp was made, he lay down like a dead dog. Hungry though he was, he would not move to receive his ration of fish, which Francois had to bring him. The dog driver also rubbed Buck's feet for half an hour each night after supper, and gave up the top of his own moccasins to make 4 moccasins for Buck. He's got some doggy booties. This was a great relief. One morning, Buck caused even the withered-up face of Perrault to twist into a grin. Francois had forgotten the moccasins, and Buck lay on his back, his feet waving in the air, and refused to budge without them. Later, his feet grew hard to the trail, and the worn-out footgear was thrown away. At the Pelly one morning, as they were harnessing up, Dolly, who had never stood out in any way, suddenly went mad. She announced her condition with a long, heartbreaking wolf howl that sent every dog bristling with fear. Then she sprang straight for Buck. He had never seen a dog go mad, and he had no reason to fear madness, but he knew that here was horror, and he fled from it in a panic. He raced straight away, with Dolly panting and frothing one leap behind. She could not gain on him because his terror was so great, but he could not pull away from her because her madness was so great. He plunged through the wooded part of the island, flew down the lower end, crossed a back channel filled with ice to another island, curved back to the main river, and in desperation crossed it. All the time, though he did not look back, he could hear her snarling just one step behind. Francois called to him a quarter of a mile away, and he doubled back still one leap ahead, gasping painfully for air. He put all his faith in the idea that Francois would save him. The dog driver held the axe ready in his hand, and as Buck shot past him, the axe crashed down on Mad Dolly's head. Buck staggered over against the sled, exhausted, sobbing for breath, and helpless. This was Spitz's opportunity. He sprang on Buck, and twice his teeth sank into his unresisting enemy, ripping and tearing the flesh to the bone. Then Francois's lash and whip came down. Buck had the satisfaction of watching Spitz receive the worst whipping yet given to any of the team. "One devil dat Spitz," remarked Perrault. "Some day him kill dat Buck." "That Buck's 2 devils," Francois replied. "All the time I watched Buck, I know for sure. Listen, some fine day him get mad like hell, and den him chew dat Spitz all up and spit him out in de snow. Sure, I know." From then on, it was war between them. Spitz, as lead dog and recognized master of the team, felt his position threatened by this strange Southland dog, and Buck was strange to him. For of the many Southland dogs he had known, not one had done well in camp or on the trail. They were all too soft and dying under the hard work, the cold, and the starvation. Buck was the exception. He alone survived and did well, matching the Huskies in strength and savagery and cunning, top of page 35. He was a masterful dog. He was dangerous because the club of the man in the red sweater had knocked all blind bravery and recklessness out of his desire for mastery. He was supremely cunning and could bide his time. It was unavoidable that the clash of leadership should come. Buck wanted it. He wanted it because it was his nature, because he had been gripped tight by this nameless, mysterious pride of the trail. It was a pride that kept the dogs working to the last gasp, that lured them to die joyfully in the harness, and that broke their hearts if they were cut out of the harness. This was the pride of Dave as the wheel dog and Solix as they pulled with all their strength. It was the pride that laid hold with them at the break of camp, transforming them from sullen, sour brutes into straining, eager, ambitious creatures. It was the pride that spurred them on all day and dropped them at pitch of camp at night, letting them fall back into the gloomy unrest and discontent. This was the pride that bore up Spitz. It made him thrash the sled dogs who made mistakes and didn't pull their weight, and who hid at harness up time in the morning. Likewise, it was the pride that made him fear Buck as a possible lead dog, and this was Buck's pride too. He openly threatened the other's leadership. He came between him and the shirkers, and he should have been punished. And he did it on purpose. One night there was a heavy snow, and in the morning Pike, the avoider of work, did not appear. He was securely hidden in his nest underfoot. Francois called and looked for him without success. Spitz was wild with anger, and he raged through the camp, smelling and digging in every likely place, snarling so frightening that Pike heard and shivered in his hiding place. Top of page 36. But when it was at last unearthed and Spitz flew at him to punish him, Buck flew with equal rage in between. It was so unexpected and so cleverly managed that Spitz was hurled backwards and off his feet. Pike, who had been trembling in fear, took heart in the open rebellion and sprang on his overthrown leader. Buck, who had forgotten the idea of fair play, likewise sprang on Spitz. Francois chuckled at the incident, but it was his job to see that justice was done, and so he brought his whip down on Buck with all his might. This failed to drive Buck from his fallen rival, and the butt of the whip was brought into play. Half stunned by the blow, Buck was knocked backwards, and the whip hit him again and again. Meanwhile, Spitz soundly punished Pike. In the days that followed, as Dawson grew closer and closer, Buck continued to interfere between Spitz and the offender. But he did shrewdly when Francois was not around. With the secret mutiny of Buck, a general disobedience sprang up and increased. Dave and Solix were unaffected, but the rest of the team went from bad to worse. Things no longer went right. There was a continual quarreling. Trouble was always at foot, and Buck was at the bottom of it. He kept Francois busy, for the dog drivers feared the coming life and death struggle between the two dogs, which he knew must take place sooner or later. On more than one night, the sound of quarreling and conflict among the other dogs turned him out of his sleeping robes, fearful that Buck and Spitz were at it. But the opportunity did not come, and they pulled into Dawson one dreary afternoon with the great fight still to come. Here were many men and countless dogs, and Buck found them all at work. It seemed that all dogs worked here. All day they were swung up and down the main streets in long teams, and at night their jingle bells still went by. They hauled cabin logs and firewood, carried freights up to the mine, and did all kinds of work that the horses did in Santa Clara Valley. Here and there, Buck met Southland dogs, but most dogs were the wild wolf husky breed. Regularly every night at 9, 12, and 3, they lifted a nighttime song, a weird and eerie chant, which Buck delighted to join. With the northern lights flaming coldly overhead, or the stars leaping in the frosting dance, and the land numb and frozen under its carpet of snow, this song was filled with the sorrow of the uncounted song, and it was one with the pain of the living, that was the pain of the wild fathers, and with the feeling of the fear and mystery they had for the cold and dark. 7 days from the time they pulled into Dawson, they dropped down the steep bank into the Yukon Trail and pulled out of Dyea in the salt water. Perrault was carrying dispatches even more urgent than the ones he had brought in. Also, he had decided to take the trip in record time for this time of year. Several things were in his favor. The week's rest had allowed the dogs to recover and had put them in good shape. The trail had been broken and was now packed harder by later travelers. And further, the police had arranged to leave deposits of food in 2 or 3 places along the route, and so he could travel light. Page 38. They made 60 Mile, which is a 55-mile run, on the first day. The second day, they were booming up the Yukon well on their way to the Pelly, but such splendid running was achieved only with the great trouble and irritation for Francois. The sly revolt led by Buck had wrecked the unity of the team. It was no longer as one dog leaping in the traces. Buck's encouragement led the rebellion into all kinds of petty crimes. No more was Spitz a leader greatly to be feared. The old respected departed, and they felt strong enough to challenge him. Pike robbed him of half a fish one night and gulped it down under the protection of Buck. Another night, Dub and Joe fought Spitz and made him hold back the punishment they deserved. And even Billy, the good-natured, was less good-natured, and why not half so humbly as in former days. Buck never came near Spitz without snarling and bristling threateningly. In fact, he behaved very much like a bully, and he was given to strutting up and down before Spitz's very nose. The breakdown of discipline also affected the dogs in their relationship with one another. They quarreled more than ever, until a time at camp was howling a madhouse. Dave and Sol-leks alone were unchanged, though they were annoyed by the unending squabble. Francois swore strange, wild oaths and stamped the snow in useless rage and tore out his hair. His whip was always whistling among the dogs, but it did little good. As soon as his back was turned, the dogs were at it again. He backed up Spitz with his whip while Buck backed up the rest of the team, and Francois knew that Buck was behind all of the trouble, and Buck knew that he knew. But Buck was too clever ever to be caught red-handed. He worked faithfully in the harness, for the labor had become a delight to him. Yet it was a greater delight to slyly start a fight among the other dogs and so tangle the traces. At the mouth of the Ticonah, one night after supper, Dub turned up a snowshoe rabbit. In a second, the whole team was in a full cry. 100 yards away, the camp of the Northwest Police with 50 dogs, all huskies, who joined the chase. The rabbit sped down the river and off into a small creek. The rabbit ran lightly on the surface of the snow, while the dogs plowed through it. Buck led the pack 60 strong, poor little rabbit, around bend after bend, but he could not gain on the rabbit. Buck's splendid body flashed forward, leap by leap in a pale white moon, and leap by leap, like some pale icy ghost, the snowshoe rabbit flashed on ahead. From time to time, old instincts drive men out of the cities and into the forest and into the plains, where they kill things with pieces of lead shot from guns. This bloodlust, the joy in killing, was shared by Buck, but in him it was far closer to the surface. He was running at the head of the pack, running this wild thing down, the living meat, to kill with his own teeth and to feel the warm blood on his face. There is a state of intense emotion that marks the life's highest point. This state comes when one is most alive, yet it also means a complete forgetfulness that one is alive. This emotion comes to an artist caught up on the sheet of a flame. It comes to a soldier on the battlefield caught up in war. And it came to Buck, leading the pack, sounding the old wolf cry, straining after the food that was alive, that fled swiftly before him through the night. He was overcome by the rush of life and the perfect joy of every muscle, joint, and spine flying under the stars and over the surface of the snow. But Spitz, cold and calculating, as always, left the pack. He cut across a narrow neck of land where the creek made a long bend around. Buck did not know of this shortcut. As Buck rounded the bend with the icy ghost of a rabbit still flying before him, he saw another larger figure leap into the rabbit's path. It was Spitz. The rabbit could not turn, and as the white teeth broke its back in midair, it shrieked as loudly as a wounded man might shriek, and at the sound the full pack of Buck's heels raised a hell's chorus of delight. Buck did not cry out. He did not stop running. He drove in on Spitz, shoulder to shoulder, so hard that he missed the throat. They rolled over and over in the powdery snow. Spitz got to his feet as quickly as if he had not been knocked down. He slashed Buck down the shoulder and jumped clear. Twice his teeth clipped together like the steel jaws of a trap as he backed away for better footing with thin, snarling lips. In a flash, Buck knew it. It was the time had come. It was to the death. They circled about, snarling, ears laid back, keenly watchful for the advantage. The scene seemed familiar to Buck, the white woods, the earth, the moonlight, and the thrill of battle. Over the whiteness and the silent brood, a ghostly calm. There was not the faintest of whisper in the air. Not a leaf quivered. Nothing moved except for the visible breaths of the dogs rising slowly in the frosty air. These dogs, which really were poorly tamed wolves, had made short work of that snowshoe rabbit. Now they were drawn up in the expectant circle. They too were silent, their eyes gleaming and their breaths drifting slowly upward. To Buck it was nothing new or strange, the scene of old time. It was as though it had always been, as though it was the usual way of things. Spitz was an experienced fighter from Spitzenberg, from the Arctic and across Canada and the Barrens. He had achieved victory over all manner of dogs. Although he felt bitter rage, he never let his rage blind him. In his passion to rip and destroy, he never forgot that his enemy felt that same passion. He never rushed until he was ready to receive a rush, and he never attacked until he could first defend and attack. Buck strove without success to sink his teeth into the neck of the big white dog. Wherever his fangs tried to bite, they were met with fangs of Spitz. Fangs clashed fangs, and lips were cut and bleeding. But Buck could not break through his enemy's guard. Then he warmed up and surrounded Spitz in a whirlwind of rushes. Time and time again he tried for the snow-white throat, where life bubbled near the surface. Each time Spitz slashed him and got away. Then Buck took to rushing as though for the throat, but instead suddenly drawing back his head and curving it from the side. He would drive his shoulder at shoulder like a ram trying to overthrow him. But instead, Buck's shoulder was slashed each time, and Spitz leapt away. Spitz was untouched, while Buck was streaming with blood and panting hard, and all the while the silent and wolf-like circle waited to finish off whatever dog went down. As Buck grew winded, Spitz took to rushing, and he kept Buck staggering for footing. Once Buck went over, and the whole circle of 60 dogs started up, but Buck recovered himself almost in midair, and the circle sank down again and waited. Buck possessed a quality that made for greatness. He had imagination. He fought by instinct, but he could fight by head as well. He again rushed at Spitz as though attempting the old shoulder trick, but at the last instant he swept low to the snow. His teeth closed on Spitz's left front leg. There was a crunch of breaking bone, and the white dog faced him now on 3 legs. Buck tried 3 times to knock Spitz over. Then he repeated the trick and broke the dog's right front leg. Despite the pain and helplessness, Spitz struggled madly to keep up. He saw the silent circle with gleaming eyes and lolling tongues and silvery breath drifting upward. The circle was closing in upon him, and he had seen similar circles close in upon beaten opponents in the past. Only this time he was the one who was beaten. There was no hope for him. Buck could not be stopped. Mercy could only be found in a gentler climate. Buck maneuvered his final rush. The circle had tightened till he could feel the breaths of the huskies on his side. He could see them beyond Spitz and to either side, half crouching for the spring. Their eyes were fixed on him. A pause seemed to fall. Every animal was motionless, as though turned to stone. Only Spitz quivered and bristled as he staggered back and forth, snarling with a horrible menace. Top of 44. As though to frighten off impending death. Then Buck sprang in and out. And while he was in, shoulder at last squarely met shoulder, and the dark circle came a dot on the moon-flooded snow as Spitz disappeared from view. Buck stood and looked on, the successful champion, the dominant beast who had made his kill and found it good.